Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and today we wanted to look at tank size. But we're going to approach it a little bit differently because often when we think about tank size, we look at gallons. And I want us to be thinking about tank size in more than just the volume. Volume's important, but so is surface area. And I think it's really important that we look at surface area when we're selecting tanks in addition to tank size. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about why surface area is important. I'm going to take you around the fish room. I'm going to show you some different tanks, look at the surface area compared to the volume. So stay tuned. All right, everyone. So before we get into the fish room and before we start walking around, a little bit about tank size and when we look at surface area compared to just volume. So there are lots of different comparisons. I'm going to take you around. We're going to look at a 20 high versus a 20 long. We're going to look at a 40 breeder versus a 55. We're going to look at some other tank sizes as well. But some things to keep in mind. Tall tanks can sometimes offer their own set of problems. For instance, in a tall tank, sometimes it may be more difficult to get water volume moving and water flow moving throughout that tank, especially towards the bottom. So that means you may have some issues with dissolved oxygen as you get closer to the bottom of that tank. Also, if you've ever worked on a tall tank before, one of the things that you'll realize is that it can be a little bit difficult. And so if you've got to make some changes to substrate, or you've got to plant some plants, or move some decorations around, or catch fish, that can be a little bit of a pain. And that's one of the frustrating things for us in some of our taller tanks, like our 150 tall or a 37 gallon. Those taller tanks are a little bit more difficult to work on. The other thing you have to consider is the fish that you're buying. Will they use all that volume? Will they use the vertical space? So maybe you've got angelfish or severums, they're taller bodied fish. A taller tank might be a good option, like a 55 gallon or a 37 gallon when they're younger, or 150 tall. But I've found, at least for us, the vast majority of the fish that we keep tend to spend most of their time in the bottom half of the tank. And a lot of them, because many of them are cichlids, tend to spend most of their time near the substrate. Because of that, if you have fish that are territorial or they're cichlids, because of that, surface area becomes really important. The ability of fish to kind of stake out their own territory, stake out their claim that's separate from other fish. So surface area is a really important aspect to consider. The other thing you might want to consider is whether or not you're going to plant your tank. Taller tanks, it's much more difficult to get light to the bottom of those tanks where the plants may be. That can wreak havoc on an ecosystem, and maybe the top half is getting a lot of light, the bottom half isn't getting quite enough light for your plants to grow, and now you're getting algae growth, and that's becoming hard to control. And so I've often found that shorter tanks, one, you can use a less powerful light, which can save you money, and two, it's easier to get light to the bottom of the tank where the plants need it, especially when they're young. All right, so now that we've got those basics out of the way, let's go around the fish room. I'm going to show you some examples, talk about surface area, talk about how it's different from one tank to the next. So I think we'll start here. This is a really good example of what I've been talking about when we look at volume. This is a 20-gallon tank. This happens to be our guppy breeding tank. So the purpose of this tank is really to breed as many guppies as we can. And so it's not necessarily set up to be awesome looking, but we've got guppy grass protecting the fry. So this is a 20-gallon tank. And as you may be aware, there are a couple different types of 20-gallon tanks. In fact, we did a comparison on 20-gallon tanks not too long ago, so I will put a link in the description for that video in case you want to take a look at it. But this is a standard 20-gallon tank, and it's about 24 inches long and about 12.5 inches wide. Now the surface area on this tank is about 300 square inches. So the way we get the surface area is you measure the length and the width, you multiply those together, and now you've got some surface area on the bottom. And so if you multiply 24 by about 12.5, you're going to come up with right around 300 inches. Now this is a very standard size tank. We've got a little bit of height, but now let's compare that to a 20 long and take a look at the surface area there. The tank that we're looking at here is a 20 long. This tank happens to house our Nanocara anomala, and it's the same volume as what we just saw, except now we're dealing with 30 inches by 12.5, and because of that we get more surface area. So we get about 375 inches as opposed to 300. What that allows us to do is maybe keep some other types of fish that would appreciate that extra surface area as opposed to the extra height. So one of the questions we get asked quite a bit is, What type of tank size should we buy? Especially when it comes to when we're getting into the larger size tanks, maybe a 55 gallon, 40 breeder. So what we're looking at here, this is a 40 breeder. It's got our star sapphire cichlids in here along with some plecos. And this is a great tank. And when you compare the 40 breeder to the 55, I actually prefer the 40 breeder. Now it's a smaller tank, right? We've got 15 gallons less in a 40 breeder, so you would think you're going to be more limited in terms of the types of fish that you can keep. That's not exactly true, and it's especially important when you're thinking about keeping cichlids. Why, you ask? Well, this 40 gallon breeder is 36 inches long and 18 inches wide. That means it has a surface area on the bottom of 648 inches. That's important, and as we're going to see when we compare that to the 55 gallon, that's a significant advantage. So now here we're looking at a 55 gallon. This 55 gallon is housing our Geophagus tapajos. We do have a species profile on these fish if you're interested in learning more. But again, the point here is to show you a 4-foot tank. It actually extends a little bit to the right. We're just being blocked by another stand. But this is a 55 gallon tank, so it's got 15 more gallons. It's a taller tank, but it's not as deep. It's only 12.5 inches wide, but it's 48 inches long. Now this tank often appears much larger than a 40 gallon breeder, and as the volume would imply, that would make sense because it is 15 gallons, it has 15 gallons more volume. But the important thing here, and especially for fish like we're looking at here with these Geophagus, they tend to stay near the bottom. And they tend to be, as you can see, fairly territorial. And we see these two fish locking up. It's not something they normally do, but we can see here we've got the male in the center. They're guarding that piece of slate, and the fish that was sparring a little bit, that's a female. And so they've chosen that little area as their breeding area. And I've done a bad job of setting this up, and it's something I'm going to fix as they've been laying more eggs. But here, the surface area compared to a 40 gallon, this is only 600 inches. So if you were to multiply 48 by 12.5, you'd actually see that this tank actually has less surface area than a 40 gallon breeder. Now, quite frankly, these fish would probably be better off in a 40 gallon breeder. And if I had one available, that's probably where I would move them to, especially this male and female. So the point here is when we're looking at tank size, 55 gallons versus 40 gallons, it's not just the volume that matters, because if you have fish that don't use the entire water column, quite frankly, like we do here with these Geophagus, they don't spend almost any time near the top of the tank. And so they are primarily bottom-dwelling fish, and they would appreciate more area at the bottom than vertical area. And that's something that we should be keeping in mind as we choose a tank size, as we choose what types of fish are going in tanks. If they're going to be staying at the bottom, surface area is more important than vertical swimming area. So one of the questions we get asked quite a bit is, should we get a 55 gallon or a 75 gallon? And to me, this is probably one of the biggest no-brainers, if you will. I would always choose a 75 gallon fish tank over a 55, provided I have the space. When you look around our fish room, we have only two 55 gallon tanks, and that's only because we didn't have the width in between those tanks and this rack that we're looking at here. But we actually have four 75 gallons. They're both 4 feet long. They're almost the same height. The difference between a 55 and a 75 is that the 75 is 18 inches wide compared to a 55 that's only 12.5 inches wide. That makes a big difference, again, in terms of surface area, which really plays a big role in the types of fish that you can keep. So as we already mentioned, that 55 gallon has about 600 square inches of surface area on the bottom, where the 75, it's got 864 square inches. So that's a big difference, and that allows you to keep lots of different fish, not just because the volume is bigger, but because you've got more space for the fish to kind of spread out and stake their claim. Now in this tank we happen to have some electric blue Jack Dempseys, and we also have a colony of Geophagus pellegrini that are growing up, and they're going to be looking pretty awesome here in the not too distant future. But this is a great tank for them. So they're going to get a little bit larger. They're going to need that surface area. Again, most of the time they're hanging out near the bottom. Now right now they're hanging out behind the plants because they don't want to be seen apparently, but this is a great tank. So if you're ever choosing between a 55 and a 75 and you have the space long term, that 75 is going to give you a lot more options. So let me show you a really extreme example of what we're talking about. We just looked at a 55-gallon compared to a 40-gallon. Now, we said at the time the 40-gallon has more surface area than the 55, and that was true. What we're looking at here is our 50-gallon low boy. This is made by ZooMed. It is 4 feet long, 24 inches wide, and it's only 10 inches tall. So it's actually 5 gallons less than a 55. But now the surface area is a huge difference. We just said in our normal 55-gallon, the surface area is about 600 square inches. In the low boy, because it's 48 by 24, it's 1,152 square inches. If we look at the fish we're keeping here, this is our multi-tank. All right, this is our Neolamprologus multifaciatus tank. If you think these fish are cool, in the description we'll have some more information about these guys. You can look at how we keep them, how we breed them. But these fish really don't go to the top of a tall tank very often. They are shell-dwelling cichlids. They like to be associated with the bottom. They like to move sand around. They like to be by their shells. The babies stay close by. So they don't need a tall tank. And so this 10-inch tank is perfect for them. We have a ton of surface area, and at times we'll have 150 or 200 of these multis in this tank. We'll thin them out a little bit, bring them to local clubs, and then we come back. And usually within about a month or two, they're repopulated again to some pretty high levels. But why is that capable of happening? Because we have so much surface area, so much territory for these fish to inhabit. So many areas where males and females can stake out some shells, and the males can actually have multiple females, and they all have their own area far away from one another, and there's breeding pockets going on all over this tank, and it's so cool to see. But this is the prime example of being able to understand the fish that you're keeping, what they need, and then pick a tank based on the fish that you're keeping, and not pick a tank and then try to put fish in after the fact. Now, would this tank work for severums or angelfish? No, probably not, because a severum or an angelfish, they're tall-bodied fish, and so they would appreciate some vertical space. But at least in terms of fish that are going to be towards the bottom, this is a great setup for them. So I hope you found that useful. I hope it kind of gives you something to think about. Again, tank volume is important, but that surface area, be thinking about that as you select your tanks. And if you have an idea of the fish you're going to keep before you pick out the tank, that goes a long way in making a good decision. Just want to say we really appreciate you watching. We appreciate all the support you've been giving us. If you like this video, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.